and thank you so much for joining the session. And I'm pretty sure a lot of researchers are there among us. And so today we are going to discuss about how we can put research to action or research to work, how we find different challenges and how we analyze them and put them to work. So today we are very fortunate to have Dr. Imran Matin, who is the Executive Director of BRAC Institute of Governance and Development. We also have Christine Kelly, who is the Associate Research Advisor, the Behavioural Insights team from UK. And we also have Farzana Misha, who is the Senior Research Associate of BIGD. So may I request our panelists to please come on the stage, and I'm now handing over the mic to Dr. Matin.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's I was actually scared. I didn't know people will actually come to this session because we have another parallel session which I think is way more exciting, and I would have chosen to go there myself. Anyway, thank you very much for coming. So let me first introduce the people here. I mean, the introduction has been done, but this is actually a collaborative effort that we are going to be putting together here between the BRAC Institute of Governance and Development with Behavioural Insight team, and we have also been working and the whole idea here is to really take a partnership between ourselves and the Social Innovation Lab at BRAC forward in terms of behavioral insights and how behavioral insights can really help us design interventions. So what we're really going to focus today is giving you a kind of a 101 type of a crash course on how to think like a behavioral designer. I think behavioral insights is primarily about looking and perceiving problems with a particular perspective. So we'll give you an idea of how that perspective works in practice with some concrete examples of how behavioral design insights can help you think through problems differently and maybe come to solutions also, in a way that is quite different from the regular way we think about problems. So it's primarily about thinking, how we think about a problem, and that's what we will be telling you about. And then we will have an exercise, and the exercise will be for you to really work with us after hearing what we have been telling you about how to think through a problem like a behavioral designer. We'll give you a problem and we'll work with you in terms of, kind of practicing that way of thinking. So, and then we'll open up for some Q&A. So that's the idea here. Now, just to frame this whole thing, I mean, to basically say that, we need to be very deliberative about design of any problem is a bit confusing, because design is everywhere, right? Because if we are not designing, it's already, we already are reacting to certain types of designs. It's just that those designs are much less explicit. They're tacit. They're perhaps not as thoughtfully, kind of randomly kind of put together. Whereas I think the behavioral design thinking is to help you make that design thinking a bit more explicit so that we can use it to satisfy the kind of objectives that we are trying to address. So I think the first point I would like to make is design is everywhere. The second point is with this theme of frugal innovation, right? I mean, usually successful behavioral design interventions are easy once we have found out what actually works, and that is the difficult part. But once we have found out, the implementation part is relatively easy compared to lots of other types of interventions. So it's easy and inexpensive, which I think goes quite well with the overall frugal innovation thinking that we basically have. And the final point that I would like to make is that one of the fundamental starting point for behavioral design thinking is that we all are biased. We have all kind of biases in the decision making that we do. And behavioral design thinking is primarily about making those biases explicit and thinking through those biases carefully and using those biases as creative opportunities to really think about solutions. So those are the kind of main kind of points, but I would now turn over to Dr. Kelly, who is going to be kind of providing the trigger presentation here.
So to get the neurons firing, let's start with a quick game. So I just want you to shout out as quickly as possible the color that you see on the screen. All right. So you can see that that is a very quick and easy demonstration of what we call System 1 and System 2 processing. So our brain functions in two very distinct ways. The System 1 is your fast, reflexive, automatic system that works very quickly. When you see a word on the screen, you read it without even thinking. When the colors and the words were different, I think we all noticed that it was a lot harder to make that immediate response, and your brain was a little bit confused because there was some conflicting information between the color and the word, and so it took you that much longer for your brain to really distinguish what you should identify from that slide. And so that's when our System 2 process kicks in. So that's our slow thinking, reflective, analytic side of the brain that tackles the more challenging problems. So a lot of the time we rely on our System 1 processing to get us through our daily lives, because if we used our System 2 to make every decision, we'd be paralyzed by information overload. We'd deliberate over everything, and we wouldn't be able to function. And so we rely on these kind of mental shortcuts, and only when we are undertaking really challenging activities, so it might be doing a complex math problem, organizing a trip. The organizers of this conference, I'm sure, were using a lot of their System 2, having to overcome challenges, think through problems, etc. And so Daniel Kahneman, who was the pioneer of this work, Nobel laureate, makes the observation that it turns out that environmental influences are much stronger than we think. So if you think about the colors, how those colors are presented really has an effect on how we can process that information. So a few more examples of that. This is from a seminal study from the 1950s. So can someone just tell me, compared to Exhibit 1, which line of A, B, or C is the same height as Exhibit 1? A, right? Everyone agree? Correct. It's not a trick question. So as Solomon Asch found in 1951, when asked individually which line was the same, 99% of the time, participants were able to correctly identify it was line A. However, he then modified the experiment to ask the same exercise in a group setting, where he'd hired actors to deliberately give the wrong answer. Then when he asked again, participants having heard other respondents say B and C, he asked participants which line is the same, and in 35% of cases, participants then deviated and followed the rest of the crowd. And so we can see from this experiment that although there is a very obvious answer, we're heavily influenced by what others around us see and do. So that causes us either to doubt our own judgment, maybe that's not the right answer after all, or even if we know that the correct answer is line A, we feel more comfortable saying line B because that's what everybody else has said and we don't want to stand out. And so basically taking away from this experiment, we come out with the idea that we're very heavily influenced by what others around us are doing. There's a picture from the original. Another interesting insight is that we're not always motivated by money. So this comes from a study in Switzerland where residents were given two sort of incentives related to whether they would be willing to host a nuclear waste facility in their community. And it turns out that calling upon residents' civic duty by saying, this is your responsibility, this is your civic obligation to host this facility, was more powerful than monetary compensation in terms of inspiring residents to want to take on the nuclear waste facility. And so again, this finding sort of runs counter to what traditional classical economics would predict would motivate people's decisions in this context. And then finally, another example is that we tend to choose easy or default options. So this example comes from the recent change from default auto-enrollment into pensions in companies in the UK. So the black bars show that where employees had to opt into pension schemes. So they had to fill in some forms, they had to actively register to become part of these schemes. Recently, the system shifted to an opt-out system. So employees were automatically enrolled into the pension, and they could submit the same form to say, actually, I don't want to be part of this scheme. And we can see that just by flipping the default, participation in the pension scheme greatly increased. So in the opt-in scenario, we have 61% and 44% of employees of large and medium firms, respectively, participating. Flipping the default to auto-enrollment, it rises to 83% and 76%. So in both cases, freedom of choice is preserved, right? So employees still have the option to participate or not. But just by choosing the starting status quo, you can have very large influences on participation. So what I hope this brief intro has made clear is that we use a lot of mental shortcuts, like biases, rules of thumb, emotions, fluency, so how familiar we are with things, social influence. All of these things influence decision-making in a way that doesn't make us irrational, but just human. And so when we're thinking about designing policies and programs, we need to take into account the fact that we as humans use a lot of other tools to make decisions. So that's where behavioral insights comes in. What are behavioral insights? They're sort of a mix of a lot of different disciplines, drawing heavily from psychology, ethnography, behavioral economics, and public policy, to understand how people behave in practice so that we can design policy better. And of course, influencing behavior is not new. There are traditional policy levers that have long been available, including laws and regulation, incentives and fines, and information campaigns. But behavioral insights has the potential to augment all of these. So we can use behavioral insights to influence and inform laws and regulations, incentives, and information to reflect how people actually behave. So what are nudges? You may have heard of this term, coined by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, also Nobel laureates in their work, nudge. And they define it as any aspect of the choice architecture that alters people's behavior in a predictable way without forbidding any options or significantly changing their economic incentives. To count as a mere nudge, the intervention must be easy and cheap to avoid. Nudges are not mandates. Putting fruit at eye level counts as a nudge. Banning junk food does not. So they make very clear that that we need to preserve freedom of choice. We need to make it easy for participants to opt out if they want to. But at the same time, we can use nudges as a way to shift people in a beneficial direction. So nudges are a very common example of the application of BI, but BI is also a lot more than this. And for the rest of the presentation, we'll talk through some nudge type examples, but also some other applications of BI. So at BIT, we apply behavioral insights to a number of policy areas, ranging from education and productivity to healthy eating and energy consumption, and combine these with rigorous evaluation techniques. We commonly use the randomized controlled trial, whereby we take our population of interest, randomly distribute it between a control group and one or more treatment groups where they're exposed to our intervention. And then we compare our outcome of interest at the end of the trial. And randomization ensures that we can be more confident that any changes observed stem from the intervention itself and not from underlying differences in the groups when we compare them. So this example is looking at an employment scheme. We can see that by introducing an employment intervention here, that more members of our intervention group have successfully found a job at the end of it, and we therefore conclude our intervention was successful. So we use these methods to evaluate our programs and support organizations, as I was mentioning, around the world, including here in Bangladesh. Oops. So I'll just run through 2 examples of applications of behavioral insights. The first style example. So at BIT, we looked at the question of how can we back into work. And so we looked at the forms that job seekers needed to fill in at job centers and realized that helping job seekers to make a concrete plan about how they were going to look for their next job. Implementation intentions and goals, like I will look for work for 2 hours every weekday straight after I drop my children at school. And also setting a high target. So we know from anchoring that if we ask job seekers, try to apply for 1 job a week. They're anchored to that target of 1 job, which means they have less motivation to try and exceed that target. Whereas if we set a high anchor, do you think you can apply for 20 jobs over the next 2 weeks? Then those job seekers are anchored to that higher target, and they might then be motivated to look for more work. So we changed the process of job seeking to include those 2 tools and found that it successfully helped job seekers back to work faster. And so now that system has been rolled out across the UK. Example 2 is how we can use BI in a sort of deeper sense to inform an underlying intervention. So this comes from work conducted by the World Bank's Africa Gender Innovation Lab, led by Marcus Goldstein, where they used insights from psychology to improve business training for entrepreneurs in Togo. So they ran a training program of 1,000 for 1,000 small-scale entrepreneurs, and they compared 2 types of training. They compared a traditional business edge managerial training, which covered topics like accounting, HR, marketing, sort of traditional business skills. And they compared it with an innovative personal innovation training course, which was based on insights from psychology that showed that non-cognitive skills like resilience and motivation and personal initiative were effective in the business context, or it led to better outcomes. And so they thought, well, can we try this out with entrepreneurs to see if this kind of training will lead to better outcomes for these entrepreneurs? And sure enough, they found that the personal initiative training had a larger impact on profits than did the traditional business training. So now we're going to go through an example of how we might run a BI project before we open up to an interactive exercise. So BIT uses a methodology we call tests. So it starts with the target phase, where we define the problem and determine measurable target outcomes. Then we move to explore, where we try to understand the context, design the interventions as part of the solution phase, test it during a trial, where we design and launch a trial, and then learn and adapt from those findings, and then finally scale effective interventions. So I'll just walk you through an example. We were set the challenge to help learners in further education colleges obtain their GCSE certificate in the UK. So further education colleges are for students 16 and older and offer a range of academic and vocational courses. But by virtue of trying to obtain their GCSE at the level of further education, it implies that these learners have failed the first time. So GCSEs are normally sat around age 14, 15. So these are learners who have struggled academically, and we're trying to encourage them to obtain their certificates. So during the target phase, we identified the behaviors within this challenge that we really wanted to target. So we moved from helping FE learners obtain their GCSEs to try and encouraging greater presence and engagement in classes, and use that as a way to increase the GCSE success rate. During the explore phase, we try to understand the user journey. By the user journey, we mean what is the experience of the participant or the end user that we're concerned about. So we use a combination of literature review, data analysis, interviews with stakeholders, and personal observations to really get a sense of the challenges and barriers that students are facing in this context. In particular, these students who have failed in the past can be demotivated and lack confidence. And that fear of failure can lead them to isolate themselves. And it means that family and friends may be not sure how to help. They're not sure what advice they can offer, what support they can give. So the solution we designed was called Study Supporter. And the objective was to strengthen student support network by engaging friends and family, and therefore help them with their studies. So students could nominate someone from a friend or family from their life to be their study supporter, and that study supporter would receive a text from the study team saying, this is what Alice is studying in class this week, and gave some tips about how they could engage in conversation about what they were covering. And so in the context of an RCT, where students were randomly assigned to receive a study supporter or not, having a study supporter increased both attendance and ultimately GCSE attainment relative to the control group. Note as well that this is driven primarily from female students, so it was particularly effective among female students. That ends the very whistle-stop tour. Does anyone have any just questions or clarifications about tests or the process, or kind of questions related to those examples?
Questions, because we'll get some time later to really, once you have engaged with the process yourself, to ask more specific questions. Anything for clarification?
Sure, so you can definitely find it on BIT's website, and I'll post all that information at the end. There'll be a slide with useful resources, so I would definitely recommend following up on BIT's website. There is also an academic paper that's linked to it.
Yeah, could you just clarify a little bit deeper about the psychological aspects that you're measuring and want to understand?
In that particular study or in general?
In general.
So I think hopefully that will become clear as we go on. There are a lot of different sort of psychological concepts that we draw on, things like social norms, things like social networks, priming participants to think in certain ways, to build confidence, social affirmation. I mean, all these kinds of things. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
I'm just wondering, where do values come into the assessment? Where do you consider value systems in the way in which you understand how to modify people's behaviors?
So that certainly comes in during the assessment of context. So during the explore phase, we would certainly do in-depth work to figure out what value systems are in place, sort of what motivating structures are relevant for participants, what an example I like to use is national pride is something that in some countries works as a very effective lever because there are very strong sentiments around nationality and identity. In other contexts, that's a less strong lever because that same sort of sense of identity isn't as prevalent. And so as part of the explore phase, you would sort of work to see what kinds of things are at play and what behavioral levers you might be able to draw on in that particular setting. Does that make sense? Okay, perfect. So then let's, oh, there's one more.
Thank you for that presentation. I was just wondering, because I have worked for Teach for Nepal, and I realized now that a lot of what the kind of training and everything that we went through, I felt like a lot of it was in a way like manipulation. So how do you know what I mean? Like psychologically trying to get us the job done, right? What are the ethics of this? Like,
That's a very good question, and it is a charge that's often leveled at these sorts of units and proponents. And I think the response, certainly from Thaler and Sunstein, would be to emphasize the choice-preserving nature of nudge. So in every scenario, it's not a mandate. It's not, this is the way you have to behave. It's, we're setting up the choice architecture. We're setting up the system in a way that navigates people towards outcomes that are beneficial both for them and for society, but still offering so making it easy and low cost to opt out of that path should participants choose. So there's definitely an ethical fine line to be drawn, but when applied properly, the idea is always to maintain that choice preservation. Does that make sense? All right, so let's move on to the next part. So this is where we'll apply some of these concepts in practice. So given the theme of the conference, we've set the challenge of decreasing youth unemployment in Bangladesh. So we'll work through how we can go from this very large, complex challenge into a concrete behavioral project. So we start again with the target phase. We're setting the outcome for this project. So the first step is to narrow the focus to a specific problem. So reducing unemployment is a very large initiative. What can we pick to help us get there? And the two things to consider when setting the outcome are the impact of the initiative. So how many people will be affected by this? Are we talking a small subgroup of people or the whole population? How large is the expected benefit? Are we expecting marginal gains or large impact? And is this an organizational priority? So we know that things that align with organizational objectives will achieve more buy-in, will achieve more support, and therefore are more likely to succeed. The second thing to think about is feasibility. So we've identified something with a large impact. Do we actually have control over the system? If we want to, or are there many other actors involved? Can we measure the outcome? How do we know if it has succeeded? Is there data available? Do we need to think about putting data collection structures in place to actually measure success? So then we tend to map. There's a trade-off. There can be a trade-off between the two. So the idea is to hit the sweet spot in the high feasibility, high impact quadrant of this graph. So we've just put together some indicative examples. Obviously, they may depend on the context and the objective at hand. But for example, if we start to think about reducing youth unemployment in Bangladesh by focusing on increasing the number of young women working in STEM industries, this may have a low impact because we're focused on a very small subgroup of Bangladeshi youth. And it may also be not as feasible because they may require high levels of technical skill and training, which may take some time to develop. On the high end of the impact scale, we could introduce vocational training into national school curricula, but that may not be as feasible because of the time and sort of the approvals and the tool development that would be needed to make that actually happen, and do all the training and sort of management that would be required to make that change. On this side, we might see that Encouraging local government officials to declare support for youth employment schemes could be very feasible. They may be very willing to declare their support. But on its own, maybe that's not enough to overcome some of the barriers to youth employment. And so is aiming for that outcome sufficient to achieve the impact that we have in mind? So something that might fall in the high impact, high feasibility quadrant could be something like encouraging uptake of apprenticeships. So here we're focused on a large population of Bangladeshi youth and encouraging them to take up apprenticeship schemes that are already offered. And so we don't have to work with a lot of different parties to sort of introduce these things. The services are there. We just want to encourage more people to take them up. All the sort of behavioral work I want, but ultimately there's a structural barrier in that people can't access the resources. Then we look at, is the desired behavior in the interests of the individual's long-term well-being? So again, we need to make sure that we're promoting activities or encouraging activities that are in the interests of the individual because it will make them more likely to do it, clearly. And so in cases when incentives are not aligned, then we're unlikely to achieve success. So we're aiming for the behavioral sweet spot where we've identified a behavioral problem that is aligned with the individual's own best interests, such as increasing the number of young people who apply to technical courses at vocational colleges. So this is the challenge that we'll be getting you to work on just now. So the next phase, we explore the context. So as I mentioned, we rely both on previous literature and data and also on firsthand research. A lot of it is instilling the kind of importance of data and monitoring and sort of that kind of standard evaluation stuff, as well as the BI concepts as well. I don't know if there's anything sort of more concrete that you're looking for, but I think there's something that we're also hoping to build on in Bangladesh is sort of. Do you want to talk further about that?
I mean, I think you know, I mean, this is a kind of, I mean, both the question that you raised and the previous question is about how to simplify this process, how to make it more, you know, kind of more rapid cycle and simplified. And I think one way to do that is really focusing on because I think most NGOs primarily there is resource they spend on M&E, right? They have monitoring data, but it's just the whole monitoring process in NGOs are just designed to be reporting oriented and not oriented towards actually decision making and management focus, right? So I think that if we can find a way how we can get more behavioral insights thinking into the admin data bit of NGOs, I think that would actually be a very, very quick win, because that is, anyway, NGOs have to do that, but you know, you basically do that a bit more thoughtfully. And then that can be used, and I don't think each and every NGO would be able to go through the whole process of doing RCTs or, you know, and all that stuff. But even if we can really get that way of thinking about problems and incorporating that into the monitoring system, then I think we would have made a huge leap. I think we have been you know, told that I should wrap up. I think this has been really, really interesting. I mean, we are, so here is some resources. I mean, of course, ourselves, but then you can find quite a lot. IPA has got a lot of resources. The World Bank has got a lot of resources. There's the Embed team, which is at the bank. So there's a lot of resources available. So you can obviously use those. We are trying to, at BRAC Institute of Governance and Development, you know, we are working with and discussing with BIT and with Social Innovation Lab to build a bit more of a systematic, sustained capacity in this area so that we can actually provide support and, you know, both to government and to NGOs, you know, using this type of method in terms of problem analysis and evaluation. So that's going to, you know, kind of watch the space, and you know, we will be in touch. And this is actually I think the first the kind of constituency, you know, for us to be actually reaching out to, and we will be reaching out to you in terms of the progress we make in terms of building that type of capacity, and would love to, because capacity in this space is not useful unless there are interesting problems, and the problems come from all of you. So I think we need a match between capacity and problems to be able to actually move the frontier, and we look forward to that engagement. Thank you all very much.